The early start of PlayStation Network saw some incredible titles being released in its indie library. Initiatives such as PlayStation Camp would bring games like Rain and Pomeranian Parade Simulator Tokyo Jungle to the table. During this time, Sony contracted various companies to create games exclusive for their online store. Being the third game in a three-game contract deal with Sony, Thatgamecompany would release the compelling Journey in March of 2012. Taking the world by storm for what is essentially a story that is told purely through music, visuals, and a unique method of communication between players. But what is it about this game that makes it so impactful? While it's difficult to put the actual impact into words as the experience differs from person to person, it's within its approach to designing it and the ideas that game company wanted to convey that you can find the core of Journey. How do you tell a story without spoken narrative? And how can you make a game that's both multiplayer and single player at the same time, with a way to communicate to other players without speaking a word? In 2009, Thatgamecompany under direction of Jenova Chen set out to tackle these challenges alongside Santa Monica Studios. And what resulted was one of the most compelling visual narratives to grace the PlayStation 3 with Journey, backed up by the incredible compositions of Austin Wintory. Journey is a game with many layers, but on the surface it is a narrative adventure game where you take the role of a traveler traversing a vast desert to reach the peak of the mountain in the distance. Along the way, you can meet other travelers with similar goals with whom you can communicate through chirping, essentially producing noises and sound waves as means to interact. For simple as the premise is for the game itself, the impact it made is undeniable. Being received with incredible critical and commercial success, winning numerous awards, and becoming the fastest selling game to date on the PlayStation Store, receiving adulation for the visual and musical art direction as well as the emotional impact. One of the leading challenges that the team over at Thatgamecompany was facing was translating the idea of subverting the traditional multiplayer approach to make it cooperative without the negative connotations surrounding it. Approaching the design of the game from a more emotional perspective, Jenova Chen wanted to create a sense of togetherness between players without having to actually rely on the other player, essentially moving together towards a common goal without needing to rely on each other to reach that goal. The challenge being removing that idea of competition entirely from the game. That way, both players could experience their own journey. But this is also what makes each playthrough of Journey a unique experience. As with each playthrough, you might encounter another traveler on the same path as you are. You only see the names of your traveling companions in the credits of the game, giving you a sense of cooperation without identity. One of the more important facets that Jen wanted to tackle was striking a balance between reliance on others and the challenge of not interrupting the other's experience, initially struggling to find ways to have the multiplayer component implemented. In earlier builds of Journey, there were mechanics like the traveler sprouting cloth pieces from it, allowing other players to use it to fly. However, this led to some dissatisfaction during playtesting, and eventually they found a middle ground. Players can meet each other from the segment with the bridge onward, and when they do, the scars they both have will change. From here, players can assist one another with clearing the area, but are unable to hinder the progress of the other. Being in close proximity will cause the symbols to glow and your ability to fly charges up. Should both players finish the segment simultaneously, they'll move into the next segment together. If not, one player will progress forward and maybe meet another player. Since Journey doesn't have any spoken dialogue, players will be differentiated by the unique symbols they produce when chirping. Neither player will know with whom they traveled until they've completed their own pilgrimage, giving everyone a goal without judgment of character. This by design makes Journey feel more like a single-player game that you can enjoy with company rather than a competitive game. However, Journey as a single-player experience doesn't come across as something detrimental. This idea of naturally being able to drop in and out makes the pilgrimage to the peak of the mountain feel much more dynamic than when having to connect to a host to play cooperatively, essentially giving a similar experience as two people randomly meeting at a bus stop. There is a feeling of loneliness to the game's premise when you're traversing the desert. The design to make the player feel small was intentional, so when you do find other life in the game, there is this unspoken bond of kinship as you're traveling to the mountain in the distance. This leads to incredible moments where you're suddenly best friends with a piece of flying cloth for a few minutes as you're traversing the sandy dunes. Everything in the game is designed to convey a specific emotion. During an appearance at GDC, Jenova Chen goes into great detail on how they designed the entirety around a specific emotional curve, using music, gameplay, art direction, and color to their advantage to create the beautiful experience that is Journey. While Journey doesn't have a spoken narrative or a set lore, most of the background story is depicted through murals that you find during your travels through the desert. They tell the story of your progenitors, the previous inhabitants of the desert, how they came to be and how they came to be gone, leaving behind only remnants of their civilization in the form of ruins. And from the peak of the mountain came a light that gave birth to life around it, lighting a spark in the animals, the trees, and eventually the white-robed inhabitants of the desert. We see a few of these robed figures bent over a spark from which the cloth ribbons we find throughout the game emerge. Curious at the potential of these cloth creatures, the white robes build their civilization, harnessing their energy to power their machines, creating a light similar to what emerged from the top of the mountain. Over time, the power of the cloth faded, causing unrest in the ancient civilization as fighting broke out over the last remaining pieces of light. Unrest became war as giant machines were constructed to lay waste to the other and their bastions. This conflict eventually led to the destruction of the civilization, sent to the ruins and gravestones we see scattered throughout the game. In Journey, you play as a traveler in a red cloak, on a pilgrimage towards the light in the mountain. It is not entirely explained why, but what is clear is that you're not the first to do so. Climbing up the first sandhill, you're met with the ruins of the ancestors with machinations that keep the cloth trapped to power these machines. After you release the cloth critters, you're carried to a monument in front of a large gate, which you can activate by singing. Here, an ancestral spirit guides the player through a vision of the aforementioned story. Beyond the gate is a ruined bridge in a large valley, and one of the first areas that you can really explore. Releasing more of the cloth critters allows them to form a bridge to help you across to a passageway on the other side. And after another vision given by one of the white-cloaked ancestors, we're off to the dune area. In this section, you get introduced to another variant of the cloth critters that I fondly dubbed the cloth puppy. It's also the first moment in the game where if you haven't met another player in the bridge area, you get a sense of companionship. The cloth puppy follows you around and seems almost playful, lifting you up, filling the scarf with more flight power, and just generally seeming to have a good time just being around you. It's quite refreshing in a game that, despite now being around 30 minutes into, does an excellent job of portraying the solitary pilgrimage that you're on. Following the path to the mountain, the traveler glides through the remnant ruins of the ancestral civilization. As the sun sets, shadows elongate and the colors of the desert become more subdued. starting off as a bright gold, eventually leading into the blue-toned tunnels of the underground. Here the traveler gets attacked by the war machines, the Guardians, likely attracted to the red cloth scarf. Narrowly escaping the Guardians, the traveler reaches the interior of a temple, where upon activating the murals, the room starts to fill with the same power that allows you to fly. Slowly, another narrative starts to unfold as you fly yourself upwards, all the while being assisted by red cloth critters ranging from the pieces of cloth to the puppies or clothfish as they're actually named, a jellyfish-like form and a very friendly whale-like creature that carries you upward. Reaching the top, we're told the story of the pilgrimage. Whether it retells your own journey or mirrors it from so many of the travelers before you isn't explicitly indicated. However, each pilgrimage starts the same way and ends the same way. From the desert that you start at the game at, through the ruins, the sandy dunes, down the tunnels facing the Guardians to this moment. And also the moment beyond. Before reaching the peak, the traveler is depicted struggling against a harsh mountain wind. After this vision, the gate opens, revealing a frozen world beyond it. Gone are the beautiful, vibrant, warm colors of the desert, now replaced with cooler blues and whites, indicating the final stretch of your journey. Battling the cold, the traveler feels its power fading. The glow from the scarf is no longer warm to the touch, now instead replaced with frigid cold biting away at the cloak and the traveler himself. The only brief moments of respite from the elements come in the form of thawed-out cloth critters and some frozen altars, finding the side of the mountain littered with increasing amounts of gravestones from travelers before you. Traversing the frozen wasteland becomes a tougher challenge as the power of flight completely fades from the traveler's grasp. As harsh mountain winds batter at them, trying to tear the last bit of warmth from its being. Surviving another attack by the Guardians that roam this part of the mountain, the traveler eventually finds its way to a valley riddled with gravestones, before the final bits of strength fade and a mountain overtakes it. The scene where the traveler collapses between the gravestones of other travelers on the same pilgrimage is deliberately left ambiguous, allowing room for the player to decide whether the traveler met his demise as shown on the murals of the tower, or if they ascend past the worldly hardships to transcend into divinity. Granted renewed strength by the spirits of the ancestors in the white cloaks, the traveler radiates a golden aura, and with one massive leap launches itself towards the peak of the mountain, breaking through the storm into the tranquil lands that cover the top. There's a fun anecdote with the scene where Jenova Chen showed the game to a friend only to have it crash on the fade to white. The friend, thinking that the game ended here, had a very strong emotional reaction to it. This caused the developers to have to revise some of the aspects of the final stretch of the game as the weight wasn't the same as the initial response to the crash. As the traveler makes his leap through the clouds, they eventually break through and are met with a paradise filled with life, contrasting the desolated wasteland of the desert below and the hard, unforgiving climate of the mountainside. This is the point in the game where the emotional crescendo culminates into one of the deepest feelings of catharsis I've ever experienced, releasing every ounce of emotion I've built up over the course of the game into a single moment, making it feel like a deep release that is hard to put into exact words. It's a moment that is both extremely simple and deeply complex at the same time. After the initial excruciating battle against the elements on the slope to the summit, this part releases all the weight of the struggles up until this moment in a perfect harmony of music, visuals, and gameplay that extends to both the traveler and the player. During the writing of the script for this video, I struggled immensely with putting this moment into words, despite it being the part of the game that prompted me to actually make this video. The pure sense of emotional release during the Apotheosis scene is intense. No matter how many times I've played through the game, the impact of the reveal after you rocket yourself towards the final steps of the journey is the same every time. Maybe it's the way the music carries the weight of the beautiful reveal of the final ascent to the peak of the mountain. Or maybe it's a feeling of general emotional weight all falling off my shoulders at once. Either way, it's this specific moment that solidified Journey as one of the most impactful video games I've ever played. From here, we ascend to the final stretch of the mountain in a beautiful display of art direction cranked up to 11. Here, you're no longer bound by the length of the scarf to fly around, and because of this, the whole sequence feels rather liberating, being able to float freely among the variety of cloth lifeforms we've met along the way, where after entering a crevice we walk into the light and the screen fades to white. During the credits, we see a light float back down the mountain, following the path of the road traveled during the game, all the way back to the beginning and the opening screen of the game, and here, the cycle starts anew. Journey is designed to closely follow the narrative beats of the Monomyth, or the hero's journey, adhering to the classical narrative archetype described in The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. In the book, the hero's journey is described as a hero ventures forth from the world of common day into a region of supernatural wonder. Fabulous forces are there encountered and a decisive victory is won. The hero comes back from this mysterious adventure with the power to bestow boons on his fellow man. At the start of the game, we see the first act, Departure, or the call to adventure, depicted through the traveler sitting in the desert, running up to June and seeing the mountain with the light in the distance. All backed up by Austin Wintory's incredible work on the soundtrack with the track Nascence, meaning beginning or rebirth, opening the game. Wintory describes this musical piece in the commentary text for the soundtrack. The idea behind this opening sequence and the enormous musical crescendo was to essentially wipe the emotional palette clean. One big surge that leaves the player as a blank canvas. The idea was to give the player a fresh start with every playthrough of the game, starting each journey with renewed vigor. Following through all the way to one of the final tracks in the game, Apotheosis, during the game's emotional climax representing the third act, Return. The soundtrack is such an important facet of the impact of the game, not only serving as a constant companion to the player, but also assisting in guiding the emotional gravity of a story told without words. In essence, Journey uses the hero's journey to represent the stages of life, from birth to midlife and to eventually death and rebirth, with color schemes to match the thematic travels, and from the vibrant reds, yellows, and oranges of the desert area to the more blue hues that the snowy mountaintop has, and a mix of all these colors in the game's palette during the final ascent, with the traveler now appearing as gold during parts of it. And during the credit sequence of the game, we see the sun now fully set, removing the color from its world only to see the sun rise again at the return to the opening screen. Continuously and closely following the narrative steps of the hero's journey as presented in the pilgrimage, the cycle of life, the colors, the music, and the transition from day to night and back to day. I haven't played a game quite like Journey. The amount of thought that went into the way that the player would feel about the game is on a level I don't think I've ever seen done this well in any video game. A game that, despite its 2-hour playtime, managed to generate the most explosive emotional response for me from the moment I broke through the final ascent until the credits rolled. And that's in a large part due to the expertly implemented soundtrack and soundscape. The dynamic soundtrack follows the player rather closely, and through the music assists in dictating a lot of the emotional weight attached to specific moments. I mentioned the commentary track that Austin Wintory did earlier in the video, and I can't recommend it enough if you want to get a deeper understanding of the philosophies behind the way the music is implemented. It's hard to describe this game in exact words, but looking at the thought process during development gave me at least a general understanding of how they tried to make Journey feel the way it does. A game that, despite its relatively elementary seeming gameplay design, has a tremendous amount of love and passion seeping through it, with all the design elements from direction to art design to color and music working together to paint this incredible picture. And with it being accessible on PS3, 4, and 5 as well as on PC, it's hard not to recommend this game to the fullest. It runs incredibly well on all systems, and with its short runtime, it can fit into most schedules. And while my experience with the game will likely differ from yours, it will definitely be an experience worth having. If you're keen on getting a physical version, the Collector's Edition is available for PS3 and 4 and comes with Flow and Flower, the other two games that Thatgamecompany made as part of the deal with Sony, alongside some fantastic bonus commentary on the game and its development. With Journey approaching its first 10 years, I still find myself coming back to it with some frequency. And while the journey may be different with each revisit, the impact always remains the same.
I've been thinking a lot about how to describe Journey. Ignore everything I've said. Just go there, be yourself, and walk through the journey yourself. The message gets through the best when you are experiencing it. And I hope that you can find something meaningful for you in the game.